Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessel Noor in Baltimore. The congressional battle over the government shutdown and debt ceiling has ended. It was resolved last night in a last-minute deal. GOP leaders conceded defeat in their stated goal of repealing Obamacare. This is Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid.
But in the end, political adversaries set aside their differences and disagreements to prevent that disaster. I thank the Republican leader for his diligent efforts to reach this important agreement. The Republican leader's cooperation was essential to reach an accord that could pass both chambers of Congress and also be signed by President Obama.
But what's it going to take to make this into a victory for Democrats? To discuss this, we're joined by Professor John Weeks. He's a professor emeritus at the University of London, author of the forthcoming book, The Economics of the 1%, How Mainstream Economics Serves the Rich, Obscures Reality, and Distorts Policy. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Weeks.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So GOP leaders conceded defeat last night in their objective of repealing Obamacare. But what's it going to take to make this into a victory for Democrats?
Well, I think that we should think about victories for Democrats and victory for the 99% in the United States. What we're facing was a very far fringe right, which was seeking to destroy every remnant of social protection in the United States. And they've moved a significant distance along the road, inducing the president to make repeated concessions on how Social Security is funded, the coverage of Medicare, and other issues, those being the most important. So I have very little faith in the Democrats. The point is that this far-right fringe, I mean, we're talking about very far right, we're talking about authoritarian, proto-fascist groups, which, if they had won this fight, would have established that they control Congress and would have been in a very strong position at the midterm elections. So that at least has been set back. I think that they hoped, the Tea Party people, the troglodytes of the Tea Party, I use a technical term, troglodytes are cave dwellers, and they are certainly cave dwellers, supported by some of the richest people in the United States, thought that their moment had come, that if they could force the president to concede on his signature achievement in the social field, then it would be all downhill for him. And they were prevented from doing that. Now, we shouldn't get too carried away with it, but we should see it as a very important and positive step that was taken. Now, the Democrats, I'm sure they're pleased with themselves. They should be pleased in a way. They did hold out. They didn't cave in like they usually do. However, the question becomes, what will their response be now? And there are many people in the Democratic Party, in the Senate and in the House, that also want to cut public expenditure and think you can lower the deficit by cutting expenditure. And these people need to be targeted by progressive groups throughout the United States and defeated in the midterm elections, or attempt to defeat them, just as we defeat the far right of the Republican Party, which I very much hope we will do.
Isn't it true that the Tea Party wing and the Republican Party, they've managed to control the entire debate, the entire narrative of issues like the debt ceiling, and the Democrats have been unsuccessful so far in really kind of challenging that whole idea that we would have defaulted on the government. The government would have essentially crashed. What's your response?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that a combination of ignorance and opportunism led the president and the Treasury. I'm sure the Treasury was receiving instruction from him. Their position that they took couldn't have been taken without the agreement of the president. That the Treasury were more alarmist than almost anybody else. They were saying if, we could default on the debt, and if we default on the debt, financial markets will go berserk, they'll have a conniption fit, and the whole world economy could be brought down into the world as we know it. So we've just been drawn back from the brink. That's all a bunch of nonsense. There was never any possibility that the U.S. government would default on its debt. None. If you don't believe me, you can go to Forbes, about as conservative and capitalist a magazine as you can find, and you'll find the same argument that I'm going to make now. In October, the debt service cost to the Treasury was about $30 billion. True, the total U.S. debt is about 17 trillion, but that all doesn't come up every month to be paid. And most of it never has to be paid. You service the debt on it because people want to hold a U.S. bond. So we're talking about covering $30 billion during October. The normal revenue inflow from taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, other taxes, is 5, 6, 7, 8 times that. So what would have happened if there had been no deal? What would have happened is that instead of paying the $81 billion to Social Security benefits, that would have been reduced to pay off the debt service. In other words, the 1% would have got their cut, there would have been no problem in financial markets, and the 99% would have taken the hindmost. That's what would have happened. The government wouldn't have broken down. This defeat of the far right, the lunatic right, has to be turned into something more than avoiding, a fascist outcome. It has to be turned into a reasonable way to advance in terms of policy. And that requires the more progressive members of Congress and Senate. It would be people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and a few others to have more influence. I don't have a lot of faith in that, but it does appear that, at least for the moment, that the far, far right has not won the day.
Professor Weeks, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I look forward to the next time on The Real News.
Thank you for joining us on The Real News Network.